This video is part 1 of Chapter 8, Complex Designs for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. When we talk about complex designs, what we're talking about is designs that involve 2 or more IVs, or independent variables, that you're looking at simultaneously. And often what motivates this is you're trying to understand how they interact. If you recall an example that I used from my own research where I was studying the impact of television program type and the impact of inserting public service announcements on attitudes towards people with mental illness. So in that case, I had 2 independent variables. One was the type of television program, and the other was whether or not there were public service announcements inserted. So that's a complex design. What we're doing with these designs, and they're often called factorial designs, where you have a combination of independent variables, you want to be able to look at their independent impact, but also the way in which they might possibly interact with one another. So what you're able to do with a complex design is determine what are called main effects, which is the independent impact of, say in the case of my study, the first independent variable, which is program type, and also the independent or main effect of the presence or absence of public service announcements. But I also wanted to be able to look at how they interact with one another, such that I can then be able to say, if I have this particular combination of independent variable conditions, I get this effect, whereas when I have a different combination of independent variable conditions, I do not. When we use a complex design, we can have at least part of that design involve repeated measures. When we do that, it's called a mixed design. So you may have one independent variable that is dealt with in a repeated measures fashion, whereas you have another that is not, and that's what we call a mixed design. Now, how we talk about the effects, and I can continue with the example of the study I was just describing. When we use complex designs, we want to look at the effects of 2 or more independent variables. Each independent variable can be looked at separately, either in a between groups design where you have different participants in those groups, or you can look at your independent variable in a repeated measures fashion, where you're differently applying your conditions in different ways. The simplest kind of complex design is what's called a 2x2 design, where you have 2 independent variables, each of them has 2 conditions, or as they're often called, 2 levels. The number of different conditions, you can determine how many separate conditions you're going to have by multiplying the number of levels for each independent variable. So with a 2x2, you can have 4 separate conditions. And why do you need to know that? Because you have to have, a certain number of participants at a minimum per condition to make valid comparisons statistically with the test that you're going to run. As your authors talk about the idea that complex designs can be more powerful and efficient when we have the inclusion of these multiple levels of independent variables, and when we're including more than one independent variable in the design. And what they mean by efficient is that you are conserving your number of subjects. So rather than doing 2 separate experiments in my lab, where one experiment looked at the impact of program type, and a separate experiment looking at public service announcements, instead I was able to combine them, use half as many subjects, and I had the added benefit of being able to test for an interaction effect. Now, I mentioned earlier there are what are called main effects, and there are interaction effects in these complex designs. Main effects are when you're looking at each independent variable separately. So in the case of my stigma research, My first independent variable was the type of television program, and I want to know, is there a difference between a highly stigmatizing program that's both stigmatizing and violent versus a program that is just violent but no stigma versus a complete control condition which has neither of those characteristics. And I can look, are those programs different in terms of people's attitudes towards mental illness? And I can do the same thing with whether or not I put public service announcements inserted in them. Then you have interaction effects. Now, the image that I pull for you here is just a way of visually representing the difference between a main effect for one variable. There, in this image, it's factor A, so variable A. Like in my research, it would have been if I compared the stigmatizing program versus the violence-only program. And I could see whether there is a difference between those two groups. Now, if I'm adding a second variable, which would be public service announcements, so what would be the combined impact of those two variables? Or in other words, what's their interaction if I look at them simultaneously? So if B represents whether or not there are public service announcements, do I see a difference in the way the two program types are responded to depending on the presence or absence of public service announcements, for example? And this image shows you a couple of different possible patterns of the way the variables are related. In this image B here, you have no interaction. You do have a difference, but it's the same kind of pattern that you saw in the main effects. Whereas in this graphic for C, you have a difference in the direction of the effects. So for condition A with the minus here, you have higher values in comparison to the A with the plus sign. When we look at the first condition of the second independent variable, you see a decreasing value from the first A condition versus the second A condition. But with the other condition of the second independent variable, you see an increasing value between those two groups. That's what's described as one version of an interaction effect. An interaction effect happens when one of your independent variables is different, it looks different, the values are different depending on the value of the second independent variable. Now here's a concrete example of a 2x2 design. This is the article on which this example is based. I'm only going to focus on a handful of the findings, not all of them. And your authors use this as an example in your text as well. The basic research questions that I'm going to talk about with this example are, do quote-unquote interrogators, these are students who volunteered for research. We're not talking about a real police officer doing interrogations, but student participants who are playing the role of interrogators, do their expectations about a suspect, in quotation marks again, another student playing the role of a suspect, do the interrogator's expectations about a suspect's guilt or innocence have an impact on the tactics that they use in their questioning? Another question, do interrogators experience what's called a confirmation bias in their initial beliefs, then turning into, via their interrogation methods, something that is going to confirm their perception of guilt or innocence in the person that they're asking questions of? Now the independent variables, you have interrogator expectation, and these are random groups, so that means that the participants were randomly assigned to groups. So you have one group that is assigned to the guilty expectation group, and the other group is randomly assigned to have an expectation of innocence. And they manipulate this through a priming procedure. Then you have A second independent variable is the actual status of the suspect. And again, you have random assignments here. You have people assigned to the actually guilty condition and people assigned to the actually innocent condition. Now, again, remember, these are not real people in the criminal justice system. These are research participants who are coming into a laboratory and they're assigned roles, and are treated differently based on the roles they're assigned to. The dependent variables, and this is where you have an observer who is counting the number of questions that they can categorize as presuming guilt. So for example, where were you when you stabbed him with the knife? I don't know if that's an actual thing that anyone said, but you get my drift. You also have the number of persuasive techniques that were used during the interview. So distinctive techniques, maybe trying to befriend the suspect versus trying to frighten the suspect. You also have ratings of the amount of effort that the interrogator appears to be using to get a confession, and those were rated by an observer. So those are the dependent variables. Now, I tend to be a visual thinker, so I like to lay things out for myself. When we talk about a 2x2 experimental design, you've got on the top here interrogator expectation, and you have two groups, guilty or innocent, and then you have suspect status, actually guilty, actually innocent, and that creates 4 cells underneath. And remember, that's you have a total in a 2x2 design of 4 separate conditions. So in the guilty and actual guilt, the interrogator believes the suspect was guilty and the suspect actually was. In the next condition, you have an expectation of innocence, but the suspect was actually guilty. In this cell, you have the interrogator believes the suspect is guilty, but they weren't. And finally, they believe the suspect is innocent, and that was actually the case. Now, the way you do data analysis in this kind of design is you're going to test for the effects of the independent variables separately. So when your authors say collapsing across the effect of the other IV, you're going to say, regardless of actual guilt or innocence, what's the difference in the dependent variables between my two expectation groups? So the group that expects guilt and the group that expects innocence. What's the difference, regardless of the actual status of the suspect, and vice versa. So the other main effect would be, what's the difference in the dependent variables when we compare groups defined by actual suspect status and we ignore interrogator expectation. So those are main effects. Interaction effects are comparing those 4 separate cells on the previous slide, where you want to know what's the effect of one independent variable. Does it differ depending on the level of the second independent variable? Now, we're not going to dig into the weeds of the math here in this class. There is a method that's employed where you are using a subtraction approach to examine these interaction effects. Again, we're not teaching this class to you from a point of view of a really math-oriented understanding of the statistics, but more of the logical approach, and then using SPSS to answer the questions for us in terms of testing our hypotheses. Now, I pulled this data just for purposes of example from the actual research article, and I was, just picking and choosing a handful of results from a much larger study just for purposes of demonstration. So you've got, again, interrogator expectation, guilty or innocent, suspect status, actually guilty, actually innocent, and this is the data for interrogator expectations. So you're comparing if you expected a guilty if you had a guilty expectation versus say an innocent expectation. Now here in this bottom box, this is the main effect for interrogator expectation. So you see higher values. If you're collapsing across suspect status, you have higher values in this one particular dependent variable than you do in the innocent condition. And here the DV is the mean number of guilt presumptive questions. So in the condition here for main effective interrogator expectation, if people expected someone to be guilty, they tended to ask more guilt presumptive questions than if they expected the person to be innocent. So if they expected innocence, they tended to ask fewer questions that were guilt presumptive. So remember the silly example I gave you, where were you when you stabbed the knife into the victim's back? That's a guilt presumptive question. Whereas, where were you at 10 p.m. last night? That's not a guilt presumptive question. Now, if we look at the main effect for suspect status, that's over here, you're collapsing across interrogator expectations, and we look at these means in the light green. And the DV we're looking at is, in this example, is the mean number of persuasive techniques when you have actual innocence on the part of the suspect. So this is the person who's playing the role of someone who's actually innocent. So they're going to resist, and they're going to say, no, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. Regardless of the interrogator's expectations, they use a greater variety of persuasive techniques asking questions because they're getting more resistance from the actually innocent suspect. In comparison to the actually guilty suspect, they use somewhat fewer persuasive techniques. Now that concludes part one. We're going to continue our exploration when we get to part two, and we'll talk more about interaction effects in that video.